Ava Thompson was the quiet one, Riley the wild one, and Pastor Elijah Moore was the man who raised them after their mother died. But behind the walls of their peaceful home in Elmsfield, a secret was growing. Two secrets, in fact. Both girls were pregnant, and both claimed the father was the same man, their stepfather, their pastor. What began as a hidden affair spiraled into betrayal, jealousy, and a murder that would shatter a town's faith and expose the darkness hiding behind a holy smile. In the quiet, tree-lined town of Elmsfield, nothing ever seemed out of place. The streets were clean, the neighbors waved, and the church stood tall at the center like a guardian of peace. It wasn't just a building, it was a heart, and the man who kept that heart beating was Pastor Elijah Moore. Elijah had arrived in Elmsfield 5 years earlier, taking over the local church after the previous pastor retired. With his calm demeanor and eloquent sermons, he quickly became a respected figure. He wasn't the kind of pastor who preached fire and brimstone. He was the kind who smiled gently, remembered everyone's name, and offered kind words in soft tones. He visited the sick, comforted the grieving, and hosted Bible studies in the chapel basement every Wednesday evening. The town trusted him, maybe too much. But the pastor didn't live alone. After his wife Meredith passed away from a sudden illness 3 years ago, Elijah had taken in her 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Ava and Riley Thompson. They weren't his biological children, but he treated them like family, or so everyone thought. Ava was the older one. At 21, she was known as polite, studious, and always neatly dressed. She played the piano in church, and was often seen helping in the kitchen during community events. Riley, just 2 years younger, was different. She wore loud colors, chewed gum during services, and often skipped Sunday school altogether. But even her rebellious streak seemed harmless in the eyes of the town. After all, who didn't act out a little after losing a parent? No one paid much attention to the unusual living arrangement. Elijah, widowed and childless, was simply continuing his late wife's wishes by raising her girls. Most saw it as admirable. If there were whispers, they died quickly, drowned out by Elijah's reputation and the good work he did. But inside the house at the edge of Oak Ridge Lane, where the church provided him a modest home, the atmosphere was something else entirely. Windows were always shut, curtains always drawn. No music, no laughter. Neighbors noticed that the girls rarely had friends over. At community gatherings, they stood a little too close to Elijah, followed his cues, watched his reactions before speaking. Some dismissed it as grief, others said it was strict parenting. But behind those drawn curtains, a much darker story had begun to take root. There were subtle signs, barely visible unless you were looking. Ava once missed 3 Sundays in a row with what Elijah called a personal matter. Riley began skipping school, claiming she was tired. Neither girl ever dated, at least not publicly. Some townspeople thought they were just shy. Others whispered about trauma. But no one ever questioned Elijah directly. He was the pastor, the spiritual guide, the man who prayed for your children and visited your dying mother in the hospital. He was untouchable. That's why when Riley collapsed during a Sunday service one spring morning, everyone rushed to help, but no one asked questions. Elijah claimed she had low blood sugar. Ava confirmed it, silent and pale beside him. Paramedics arrived. She was taken to the hospital, but the moment passed quickly, and life returned to normal. Or so it appeared. Behind that incident was a secret so tangled, so dark, it would eventually fracture their world. A secret that tied all 3 of them together, in blood, betrayal, and something far worse. And in that quiet house behind the church, where scripture was read every morning and prayers were said before every meal, sin was not a distant concept. It lived among them. It shared the table, it touched every surface, lingered in the hallways, and slept behind every closed door. Elmsfield didn't know it yet, but their beloved pastor was not who they thought he was. And the perfect family he appeared to protect? It was already on the edge of unraveling. Ava had always been the quiet one. She blended into the background like a shadow, always composed, always agreeable. Riley, on the other hand, could never sit still. Her moods shifted like the weather, warm and bubbly one day, cold and distant the next. They lived under the same roof, ate the same meals and prayed under the same ceiling beams. Yet the space between them was widening, quietly, dangerous. What started as an odd silence between the stepsisters grew into something heavier. A presence, a tension in the air that neither of them spoke of, but both felt. It was in the way they avoided eye contact at dinner. It was in how Riley stopped playing music in her room, how Ava began sleeping with her door locked. And at the center of it all stood Elijah Moore. To the world, Elijah was still the same kind-hearted pastor who led Sunday services with patience and grace. But inside his home, the lines between guardian and something else had already blurred. It hadn't happened all at once. It was slow, calculated, like water boiling so gently you don't realize it's burning you until it's too late. It began with praise, quiet, personal affirmations that made each girl feel like the most important person in the room. Elijah's voice, always soft and calm, told them they were special, chosen, loved more than anything. For two girls who had lost their mother and felt invisible in the world, his attention felt like safety. But it wasn't love, it was control. By the time Ava realized what was happening, she was already in too deep. She didn't want to speak up, she couldn't, and maybe, in a twisted way, she didn't want to lose the version of Elijah who made her feel seen. Riley, at first, rebelled against it, but Elijah's words eventually found their way through her walls too. He knew exactly what to say to each of them. He didn't need to raise his voice. He just needed to remind them they were his. It was Riley who first suspected the truth, that they weren't the only ones being told these things. That maybe the love Elijah gave wasn't special at all, but a lie he repeated, over and over. She noticed the subtle changes in Ava's body, the way she avoided mirrors, the way she clutched her stomach when she thought no one was looking. Riley felt the same changes happening to herself. At first, she thought it was stress. Then nausea began. Fatigue followed, and one night, hidden in the bathroom with shaking hands, she stared at the thin blue line on a pregnancy test, and knew her life was no longer her own. Riley confronted Ava in whispers, too afraid to speak the truth out loud. Ava didn't deny it. She didn't even cry. She simply nodded, slowly, like the weight of her secret had already crushed her spirit. Both girls, pregnant by the same man, their stepfather, their pastor, had been trapped in a nightmare masked as devotion. They made a pact that night, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of the town finding out. Fear of what Elijah would do if he felt threatened. Fear of being called liars. They promised each other they would never tell. No doctors, no police, no friends, only each other. It was the only way they thought they could survive. But secrets this big don't stay quiet for long, especially when they involve the most trusted man in town. Every smile he gave from the pulpit, every handshake after service, every sermon about purity and virtue, it was all a performance, a mask worn by a man who had corrupted the very souls he claimed to protect. The pact between Ava and Riley wasn't one of unity. It was desperation disguised as loyalty, and in time, the weight of it would break them apart. The truth, buried beneath layers of guilt and silence, would start to claw its way out. And when it did, it wouldn't just destroy them. It would tear the entire town of Elmsfield to pieces. Detective Lila Monroe hadn't come to Elmsfield looking for trouble. After a decade in Chicago, where she'd seen more than her share of homicides and broken lives, Elmsfield was supposed to be her soft landing, a place with clean sidewalks, sleepy cafes and a police station that mostly dealt with parking complaints and noise violations. But small towns have a way of hiding their darkest rot under the cleanest surfaces. And it didn't take long before something about the town's golden pastor started to itch at her instincts. It started with Jordan Price, a local journalist known more for covering charity fundraisers and weather updates than anything serious. He was young, eager, and constantly on the lookout for a story big enough to earn him credibility beyond Elmsfield's borders. Jordan had grown up in the town, attended Pastor Elijah's church, and knew everyone by name. He wasn't looking for scandal, at least not at first. But something about the pastor's household had caught his eye, and once he started digging, he couldn't stop. Jordan had noticed how Riley, once so outspoken and wild, had become withdrawn in recent months. She'd stopped posting on social media, stopped showing up at school events, and seemed to vanish entirely after a sudden collapse during a church service. Ava was even more mysterious. Her attendance at college dropped off suddenly, and she was rarely seen in public without Elijah by her side. Jordan thought it was strange, especially for two young women who were once so different, now acting like shadows of themselves. He brought his suspicions to Lila with caution. At first, she assumed it was a case of overactive imagination. But then Jordan showed her something she couldn't ignore. Photos taken from behind the church, near the dumpster, where he had found shredded paper and torn medical forms. Among the debris were fragments of ultrasound images, 2 of them, both labeled with initials that matched Ava and Riley's. That detail changed everything. Lila couldn't open an investigation on speculation alone, but she began paying closer attention. She watched Elijah during Sunday services, observed his interactions with the community, always polished, always calm. But she noticed subtle things, the way Ava avoided his gaze, the way Riley seemed to flinch when his hand brushed her shoulder in old photos Jordan had saved from the church website. There was a script they were all following, but it wasn't written by any divine hand. Unable to resist her instincts, Lila requested hospital records under the radar. What she found raised more questions than answers. Riley had been admitted weeks earlier for dehydration and nausea, with pregnancy listed in the report. No follow-up appointments, no official guardian present. Ava's college absence lined up almost perfectly with a similar diagnosis. 2 pregnancies, 2 girls from the same house, and 1 man connecting them both. Still, there was no concrete evidence tying Elijah to anything, not yet. And in a town like Elmsfield, accusing the pastor was akin to blasphemy. No one wanted to believe something so vile could happen in the home of a man who led prayers, baptized children, and held grieving hands at funerals. But Lila had spent her career learning that the most dangerous people were often the ones others trusted most. She began driving past the church late at night, watching for patterns. The lights in Elijah's house stayed on long past midnight. Deliveries came at odd hours. Ava once stepped outside, barefoot and glassy-eyed, only to turn back inside the moment she noticed Lila's unmarked car across the street. Lila didn't know what she was looking at yet, but she knew something was wrong, deeply wrong. Whatever was happening inside that house wasn't just a family tragedy, it was something darker, something twisted. And if her gut was right, it was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. Riley Thompson's disappearance wasn't reported right away. Elijah told the congregation she had gone to stay with relatives for a while to clear her mind. Ava backed him up, nodding silently during the brief announcement at the end of a Sunday service. No one asked questions. People trusted Elijah. He said Riley needed time and that was good enough for a while. But the town began to notice. Her absence stretched from days into weeks. Her friends received no texts. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Social media went silent. Even Jordan Price, the young journalist who had been keeping close tabs on the story, grew uneasy. Riley wasn't just gone. She had vanished, and no one but Elijah seemed calm about it. Detective Lila Monroe had been circling the situation for weeks, waiting for a sign. Riley's disappearance was that sign. She filed an official missing persons report and got the paperwork moving quickly, carefully, quietly. The town didn't need to know yet, not until there was something real to hold on to. But she was watching Elijah closer than ever. One morning, a church volunteer named Clara Hughes showed up at the station, trembling. She had been tending to the garden behind the church, where roses bloomed in perfect rows along a curved stone wall. It was Elijah's pride. He often preached that tending to God's earth was a way to tend to the soul. But Clara had found something that didn't belong. Near the back edge of the garden, where the soil was recently turned, Clara noticed dark, crusted stains seeping through the ground. It wasn't mud. It wasn't fertilizer. It was blood. Lila moved fast. A forensic team sealed off the garden and began digging. Hours passed under the summer sun. Parishioners gathered at the edges of the yellow tape, whispering and crossing themselves. Elijah stood with them, his face unreadable. Ava stayed inside the house, pale behind the curtain. Then the shovel hit something soft. Beneath the soil and flower roots, barely 2 feet down, they uncovered a shallow grave. The body, curled and hastily buried, was wrapped in a church quilt. The pattern was familiar, sewn by a group of elderly women, as a donation. Blessed during a service just 2 months earlier, a pair of red sneakers peeked out from beneath the cloth. Everyone who had ever known Riley recognized them. The town's illusion cracked instantly. Elijah was questioned on the spot. He insisted he had no idea how the body ended up there, claimed Riley must have taken her own life and someone had hidden the truth to spare him the shame. But his calm started to waver. His voice grew thinner. His hands trembled when he adjusted his collar. Lila didn't believe a word of it. Back at the house, a warrant allowed police to search the property thoroughly. In the basement storage room, officers found a locked chest containing personal items, letters, jewelry, and a stained Bible that once belonged to Riley. In one corner, folded carefully, was the dress she had worn the night before she vanished. It was torn and spattered with something dark. Lab tests would later confirm what Lila already suspected: it was blood. Still, the evidence wasn't enough to charge Elijah with murder. Not yet. There were no fingerprints on the shovel, no witness to the act, and the quilt could have been taken by anyone in the congregation, but the discovery had shattered the perfect image. People began to talk. Old memories resurfaced. Odd moments, strange glances, things ignored. The town had been blind. Now its eyes were wide open. And behind the curtain of faith and flowers, the real horror was only just beginning to come into focus. The town of Elmsfield wasn't ready for the truth, but once Riley's body was pulled from the garden soil, denial became impossible. Whispers turned to murmurs. Murmurs became outrage. The once adored Pastor Elijah Moore was now a man cloaked in suspicion. His reputation, once bulletproof, was crumbling under the weight of something no prayer could fix. But Detective Lila Monroe knew that suspicion alone wouldn't be enough. She needed motives. She needed truth, and she needed to understand how a respected man had become the central figure in such a dark, tangled mystery. As the investigation widened, Lila began mapping out timelines, comparing testimonies, and dissecting every movement inside the pastor's home in the weeks leading up to Riley's disappearance. What she found was a web of twisted emotions, unspoken jealousy, and dangerous manipulation. The deeper she dug, the more the center of the story shifted, from Elijah to the 2 girls who had lived under his roof, both carrying a secret too heavy for their young lives. Riley had not simply vanished. She had been silenced. Autopsy reports revealed bruises and defensive wounds, clear signs of a struggle. She didn't slip away in her sleep. She fought. Someone made sure she didn't get back up. And the more Lila examined the final weeks of Riley's life, the more cracks she saw in Ava's behavior. Ava had always been quiet, obedient, and composed in public, but behind that controlled exterior, something darker stirred. She had isolated herself from friends, missed classes, and spent hours inside her room. Neighbors reported hearing arguments from the house at odd hours. One even recalled Ava yelling Riley's name late one night, followed by a door slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. It became clear that the sisters' relationship had soured in the weeks before Riley's death. Riley had confided in Jordan Price, the journalist, just days before she died. She told him everything: the pregnancies, the manipulation, and the fact that Elijah had promised to choose her over Ava. Riley believed she was the one he loved more, the one he would protect. She thought she had power. But power in Elijah's house was a cruel illusion. Ava had her own version of that story. though she kept it buried deep beneath her surface calm. She had believed she was special too, that Elijah loved her uniquely, but when she realized Riley was pregnant as well, her world cracked. Elijah hadn't just betrayed her, he had made her feel disposable, and that kind of heartbreak, Lila knew, could make people do terrible things. The toxic triangle that formed between the three was now coming into focus. Elijah had manipulated both girls, playing them against each other under the pretense of affection. His control wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. He had twisted their grief and dependence into something poisonous. Ava and Riley, instead of supporting one another, had begun to see each other as rivals for Elijah's love, and in that pressure cooker of silence, control, and isolation, resentment took root. Lila was beginning to believe that Riley's death wasn't the result of a premeditated murder, it was a culmination, a collapse, a boiling point that erupted behind closed doors, and whoever delivered the final blow, she was certain, hadn't acted alone. There were still pieces missing. The murder weapon had not been found. Ava remained distant, emotionally flat, during questioning. Elijah maintained his innocence, spinning his story around sorrow and confusion. But Lila knew that somewhere within that house, someone was hiding a moment of violence. A moment so irreversible that it buried not just Riley's body but any illusion of innocence Elmsfield had left. The motive wasn't just jealousy, it wasn't even fear. It was love, warped, twisted, and weaponized. And it had already claimed one life. The breakthrough came when no one was expecting it. The case had begun to stall. The church garden had been combed, the house searched twice. Elijah and Ava both questioned repeatedly. The community was beginning to fracture, half still clinging to the image of Pastor Elijah as a wronged man, the other half bracing themselves for a truth too dark to say out loud. But neither side was prepared for what Jordan Price found buried not in the ground but in drywall. Jordan, restless and obsessed, couldn't let the story go. He had grown up believing in Elijah, just like everyone else. But now he couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about Riley, about her sudden change, her disappearance, the strange look in Ava's eyes every time Elijah spoke. He began watching the house when no one knew, taking photos, studying patterns. Then, after slipping into the church under the pretense of delivering candles, he noticed something off in Riley's old room. The vent cover near the floor had scratch marks along the edges, as if it had been removed and replaced. He crouched, unscrewed it, and reached inside. What he pulled out made his heart stop, an old, cracked phone with a pink case, coated in dust. The battery was dead, but the damage was minimal. Jordan turned it in to Lila immediately. It was Riley's phone. After charging it and retrieving the contents, Lila scrolled through photos, messages, notes, most of them normal, until she found a single video dated just one day before Riley vanished. The file was 13 minutes long, shaky, dim, but it was her. Riley sitting cross-legged on her bed, eyes red and tired, whispering as if someone might hear her through the walls. In the video, Riley poured out the truth, raw, unfiltered, and terrifying. She spoke of the fear that never left her, how she never truly felt safe in the house after her mother died. How Elijah changed after the funeral, how he would touch her shoulder too long, how the compliments became personal, then private, then something else entirely. She confessed her pregnancy. She said Ava was pregnant too, that Elijah had promised them both different things. He had told Riley that she was the only one who mattered, that Ava was broken, weak, and couldn't handle the weight of being his chosen. But he had told Ava the same about her. It was a game, a performance. And they were the audience, blindfolded. Riley explained how the lies began unraveling. She'd caught Elijah whispering to Ava late at night, saw his hands resting on Ava's stomach the same way they had rested on hers. The illusion shattered, and that's when the tension began. Riley admitted they argued, harshly, that she had told Ava she would go to the police, that she was done protecting anyone, that Elijah didn't own her, and neither did his lie. She ended the video with a final statement that pierced Lila's spine like ice. "If I go missing," she whispered. It wasn't suicide. It was love, turned into control. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a warning. A message in a bottle tossed into the storm of her final days, and now, finally, someone had found it. Lila watched the video 3 times, her jaw tight, her eyes burning. This wasn't just about manipulation, it was about systematic grooming, coercion, and a house turned into a cage. Riley had seen the truth. She had tried to escape it, and for that someone made sure her voice was silenced. Until now. This video was no longer just evidence. It was a voice from beyond the grave. And it was about to change everything. The release of the video changed the course of the investigation overnight. Once a haunting suspicion, Riley's death now had a voice, a witness, and a motive all embedded in a 13-minute recording. It wasn't just testimony, it was a lifeline thrown from the grave. The town of Elmsfield could no longer look away. Pastor Elijah Moore, once seen as the embodiment of trust and virtue, now stood exposed as a man whose influence had reached into the most private, most sacred corners of 2 young lives. Detective Lila Monroe wasted no time. With the video as leverage, she secured a new search warrant for Elijah's property. This time, they weren't looking for general evidence. They were hunting for connections to Riley's final days. The basement, which had been locked during the first sweep, was now forced open. Inside, the air was thick and stale, and dust clung to every surface. In the corner stood a sealed plastic bin, tucked beneath old church robes and outdated hymnals. When Lila opened it, she paused. Inside were articles of clothing. Riley's hoodie, a pair of jeans, a hairbrush still tangled with strands of her red hair. But what chilled Lila most was the pair of gloves lying at the bottom, thin, latex and streaked with what would later be confirmed as blood. The lid bore a single smudge, a partial fingerprint that when analyzed matched Ava. Ava was brought in again for questioning. She didn't cry, she didn't protest. She sat still, her face pale, hands folded tightly in her lap, as if rehearsing stillness had become her only way of surviving. But this time, her answers faltered. When asked about the gloves, she claimed she'd never seen them. When pressed about the video, she said nothing. Later that night, during a routine hospital visit for prenatal complications, Ava was sedated for a minor emergency procedure. What happened next stunned everyone. Under the haze of anesthesia, with no awareness of who was present, Ava began mumbling. The nurse on duty, trained to listen for signs of distress, leaned closer. He said it wouldn't hurt her, said she'd just fall asleep. The nurse froze. She was going to ruin everything, Ava whispered. I didn't mean to push her. I just wanted her to The words were recorded, admissible, and devastating. Lila now understood what had happened. Riley had confronted them both. She had threatened to go public, to destroy the carefully constructed world Elijah had built, and Ava, already drowning in jealousy and confusion, saw Riley not as a victim but as a threat. It wasn't a premeditated plan, it was a moment of rage, of panic, of heartbreak, but it had ended with Riley's blood soaking the church garden. The story that unraveled was more twisted than Lila had imagined. Elijah had created an emotional battlefield where love was a weapon, where control masqueraded as care. He had pitted 2 vulnerable girls against one another, whispering different lies to each, feeding their need for affection, loyalty, identity. And when one of them broke free, even for a moment, the fragile illusion shattered violently. Elijah was arrested on charges of statutory rape, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to conceal a crime. Ava was charged as an accessory to murder, her confession, however, indirect, sealing her role in Riley's final hours. The town watched in stunned silence as the 2 were led away in handcuffs. The church, once full every Sunday, stood quiet, its pews empty, its stained glass windows casting light on a pulpit now drowned in shame. Riley had been silenced once, but now, through her voice, justice had begun to speak. The trial of Pastor Elijah Moore and Ava Thompson gripped Elmsfield like a slow-moving storm. Courtroom seats filled with familiar faces, neighbors, former parishioners, and people who had once trusted Elijah with their confessions and their children. Now they sat in silence, watching as the truth unfolded in chilling detail. Each day brought new revelations. Each testimony peeled back another layer of deception. Elijah remained stoic through most of it, dressed in dark suits and keeping his eyes lowered, as if in prayer. But his silence wasn't penance. It was calculation. He denied everything, claiming the girls had misunderstood his intentions. He said Riley was troubled, unstable, that the pregnancy wasn't his. But then the medical records surfaced. DNA tests, taken from the remains and confirmed, beyond doubt. The child Riley carried had been his. So was Ava. That alone was enough to bury any image of innocence. But the trial didn't end there. Prosecutors played the video Riley recorded, her voice echoing across the courtroom like a ghost, unwilling to stay silent. Some in the room wept. Others stared at Elijah, wide-eyed, as if seeing him for the first time. Riley's voice was not angry or vengeful. It was tired, honest, and her final words, "If I go missing, it wasn't suicide. It was love turned into control," hung in the air long after the screen went black. Then came the nurse's testimony. She recounted Ava's drugged confession, every word of it. The defense tried to discredit it, but the damage was done. The physical evidence, the gloves, the bloodied clothes, the fingerprint on the bin, was undeniable. Ava had helped hide the crime. Whether out of fear or blind loyalty, she had become complicit in Riley's death. Ava herself never testified. She sat quietly, her body thin and fragile, her eyes hollow. At 7 months pregnant, she was now carrying the only living piece of Elijah's twisted legacy. Some believed she had been manipulated as much as Riley. Others saw her as cold, calculating, a girl who chose loyalty over justice. In truth, she was both victim and participant, broken and dangerous. Elijah was sentenced first, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called his actions a systematic abuse of power cloaked in faith. His conviction included charges of sexual abuse, coercion, and second-degree murder through conspiracy. As he was led out of the courtroom, he didn't look back. He never spoke a word. Ava's sentencing came a week later. The court weighed her age, her mental state, and the years of manipulation she had endured. But they also weighed Riley's death, avoidable, brutal, and buried under lies. Ava was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. She broke down only once, when the judge mentioned Riley by name. The church in Elmsfield closed permanently. Its stained glass windows were removed, the altar stripped bare. The garden where Riley was buried became a memorial, simple, quiet, and surrounded by wild roses that no longer grew in perfect lines. Townspeople left notes there, candles, and on some nights, someone would leave a single pair of red sneakers by the headstone. Jordan Price published a detailed exposé that made national news. His story didn't just unravel a crime, it exposed how easily power can mask evil, how silence protects monsters, and how victims can vanish long before their bodies do. Detective Lila Monroe stayed in Elmsfield a while longer. She visited the garden often, not as a cop, but as someone who had looked into the heart of something dark and come out the other side. She never forgot Riley's voice. She never forgot what it cost her to speak. In the end, it wasn't justice that brought peace to Elmsfield. It was truth, ugly, raw, and unrelenting. The kind of truth that could only rise after everything else had burned away.